On August 25th, 1968, 7 protesters showed up in Moscow's Red Square to unfurl banners against the Soviet Union's invasion of neighboring Czechoslovakia. Soviet tanks were sent to crush the democratization there known as the Prague Spring. The protesters were beaten and arrested by the KGB within minutes, but the impact of their brief display of bravery continues to reverberate today, becoming the defining symbol of Vladimir's struggle, capturing the power of lone acts of resistance. The imagery recurs throughout Vladimir's statements and conversations with friends, as a source of inspiration and a way to demonstrate to the world that there are Russians who oppose this war. In his acceptance speech for the Council of Europe's Václav Havel Prize for defending human rights in Russia, Vladimir closed with the 7 protesters, and noted that a Prague newspaper then wrote, quote, "There are now at least 7 reasons for which we will never be able to hate the Russian people." And while Putin tries to paint Vladimir as a traitor, his sacrifice is clearly animated by a true patriotism for his people and country. I'm your host, Yonah Diamond, from the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and this episode will look at the historical figures and events motivating Vladimir through his sacrifices today, giving us reason to be hopeful. You'll hear directly from former Soviet political prisoner Natan Sharansky on how he persevered through 9 years in prison and ultimately came out on top. This is The Price of Conviction, A Tale of Two Vladimirs, Episode 3, Historical Memory. The old adage, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," is perhaps nowhere more applicable than in Russia today. And there's no one that embodies the reverse imperative to preserve the lessons of the past more palpably than Vladimir. The imprint of the past saturates his writings, films, speeches, and advocacy. And as a remarkable testament to his photographic knowledge and commitment to history, he's managed to continue weaving these references in his Washington Post column, to which he's contributed over 10 articles since his arrest alone via letters from prison.
I had a chat with his editor, Christian Karl.
This is David Hoffman, longtime editor at the Washington Post.
And Christian said that as a writer of these columns, Vladimir was absolutely meticulous. It fits sort of his rigorous ideals of honesty. He said he'd often had these really intense discussions with Vladimir about little details in his columns. And on several times in jail, we sent the edits back to him through his lawyer. And then, Vladimir sometimes will edit the edits. And then, of course, because he can't pass paper, he has to sort of do like a copy of the edit and give it to Vadim, who had to give it to us. But the guy was extremely involved with his choice of words, with exactly what he wanted to say. Christian told me he takes his writing as seriously as he does his political beliefs.
Vladimir draws on the lessons of Russian history to navigate and resist today's repressive system, and to reinforce his eternal optimism to persevere through his own impossible situation, a 25-year virtual death sentence. In one of his columns from prison, he writes, quote, "What really helps is my background as a historian, because all of this has happened before, and we know how it'll end. Aggressive wars launched by Russian and Soviet rulers for domestic political purposes, from the Crimean War of the mid-19th century to the misnamed, quote, small victorious Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, to the invasion of Afghanistan in the 1970s and 80s, ended up backfiring badly on their masterminds, who managed to turn both their own people and the world against them. This war will be no different. And it's remarkable how diligently Putin is stepping into the same traps. The great Russian historian, Vasily Kluchevsky, once said that, quote, history doesn't teach anyone anything. It only punishes for lessons not learnt. It won't be long before Putin finds out just how true these words really are. While Vladimir may be right, the Kremlin's doing everything in its power to prevent its citizens from learning the lessons of Russian history, to clear the path for its aggressive war, atrocity crimes, and repression at home today. To this end, the regime has engaged in a campaign to control Russia's historical memory and carried out a purge of the remaining historic human rights organizations, starting with its most significant, Memorial, just 2 months before the full-scale invasion. Last year, the magnitude and importance of Memorial was recognized by the Nobel Committee in awarding them the Peace Prize for their historical work preserving the memory of Soviet state terror and atrocities, and for their present-day defense of human rights and political prisoners. To illustrate just how dire the situation is, this was the second consecutive year a Nobel Peace Laureate hailed from Russia, following Dmitry Muratov, editor-in-chief of one of the last Russian independent newspapers, Novaya Gazeta, which was also closed down last year during the purge of independent media, after 6 of its journalists were murdered over the years. The Moscow-Helsinki Group, Russia's oldest human rights organization, and the Sakharov Center, established to carry on the legacy of Nobel laureate Andrei Sakharov, were both closed down earlier this year. Andrei Sakharov played a key role in developing the Soviets' hydrogen bomb, but increasingly questioned his life's work and warned against the dangers. In 1968, he released a groundbreaking manifesto calling for international cooperation, intellectual freedom, and peaceful coexistence, motivated by the threats of collective destruction and nuclear annihilation. His manifesto was circulated by dissidents underground and published by the New York Times. He devoted himself to the cause of human rights and political prisoners, and all of a sudden went from the inner circles of the Communist Party with direct access to the Soviet leader Khrushchev to becoming the uniting moral authority of the Russian dissident movement. In 1975, he was involved in drafting the Helsinki Accords, and importantly, the human rights provisions for which the Helsinki Group was formed to monitor Soviet compliance. He then won the Nobel Peace Prize that year and was later a founder of Memorial. In 1980, he was sent to internal exile in Gorky after denouncing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Vladimir's commitment to looking to the past for lessons is always present and exemplified by his deep respect for Soviet dissidents. There's a strong tradition of fellowship and admiration within the dissident community, turning to the older generation for wisdom and strength. In fact, the last person Vladimir visited before his arrest was the 89-year-old avant-garde dissident artist Boris Zhutovsky, who's painted trials of Russian political prisoners. As Bill Browder recounts that fateful evening,
so he had gone to visit a Soviet dissident, an artist who had been involved in all sorts of opposition for many years, even during the Soviet time. And he had come back, and he was in a good mood. And he parked his car and stepped out of his car, and that's when the police were waiting for him.
That would be the last time Vladimir would see Boris Zhutovsky, who died in March of this year. But the symbolic visit would keep the flame of Zhutovsky's wish alive that the new generation refused to accept censorship as the status quo in Russia. As early as 2005, in Putin's annual State of the Nation address, he called the collapse of the Soviet Union the, quote, greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Meanwhile, at just 24 years old, Vladimir Kara-Murza was releasing his first documentary that year, titled They Chose Freedom. The objective of the project was to show that even a small group of citizens prepared to defend their dignity and freedom can eventually prevail over dictatorship. He traveled around the world collecting interviews with notable Russian dissidents to tell their story of the movement from the 50s through the 90s. The Russian premiere of the film was held at the Sakharov Center. At his first court hearing, Vladimir can be seen behind the glass cage reading The Gulag Archipelago by the Nobel Prize-winning writer and Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a survivor of the Gulag and himself charged with treason before being expelled to West Germany. The Gulag was the Soviet system of prison, forced labor camps, and terror that took the lives of 1.7 million people under Lenin and Stalin. And just as Vladimir is a student of past horrors, before his imprisonment, he'd also looked to the past for glimmers of hope, as reinforcing his belief in the power of international campaigning to get political prisoners released today. This is Vladimir in our interview from 2020.
One of the main reasons that Anatoly Sharansky was released by the Soviet government in the mid-1980s was the long and public and active international campaign.
Anatoly, or Natan Sharansky, was one of the dissidents Vladimir interviewed for his documentary. a founder of the Moscow-Helsinki Group, spokesperson for Andrei Sakharov, and a leader of the Soviet Jewry movement for the rights of Jews to leave the Soviet Union, known as Refuseniks. Like Vladimir, Natan was also convicted on high treason, a charge very rarely leveled at activists at the time. In fact, similar to Vladimir, Natan was the first dissident of the era to be accused of high treason in the form of, quote, assisting foreign countries in their hostile activity against the Soviet Union. In 1978, Time magazine characterized Sharansky in a cover story as the, quote, personification of the struggle for human rights being waged by the Soviet Union's dogged dissidents.
Many prominent Soviet prisoners of conscience, not only Sharansky, but also Vladimir Bukovsky and Yuri Orlov, and Alexander Ginsburg, and many, many others, were released from their imprisonment because there was such strong international advocacy on their behalf, and because there was such strong international pressure on the Kremlin to release them.
For inspiration on how to campaign for political prisoners, Vladimir looks to Erwin Kotler, or Prof as we call him, the chair of our center and visionary behind an entirely new field of international political prisoner defense, opening the door for a whole generation of lawyers like me. And he's been perfecting this advocacy model for more than 40 years, which all started with Natan Sharansky.
Sharansky was the first political prisoner whose case and cause I got involved with.
Vladimir often shares a line passed down by Prof.
Erwin Kotler, Canada's former Justice Minister, one of the foremost international human rights lawyers, once wrote that a political prisoner's worst nightmare is to be forgotten.
And these words capture the very purpose of this podcast, not only to keep the spotlight and pressure up on their cases until they're released, but also to support these political prisoners through this process by showing them the world stands in solidarity, that they're never alone. Though Natan spent 9 years in Soviet prison, half in solitary confinement, more than 400 days in punishment cells, and more than 200 days on hunger strike, plunging his weight below 80 pounds at one point, his is a success story, as he was ultimately released in 1986 due to a sustained international campaign. In April of this year, I sat down with Prof and Natan to hear their first-hand accounts of what it takes to overcome these impossible circumstances. We spoke in front of a painting of Andrei Sakharov, wearing a soft but serious expression, in casual, unassuming clothes, gently motioning his hands with reassurance before a physics diagram on a blackboard, projecting his intellectual, empathetic, and moral stature. Natan told me it was painted by a local artist from the region where Sakharov was in exile. And we actually conducted our interview just a week after the Sakharov Center was closed down in Moscow. But for me, this painting captured a presence that cannot be contained, one that was always with Soviet dissidents and is always with us today, the watchful and uplifting gaze of a moral leader. Yevgenia today is playing a similar role in leading the campaign for Vladimir as Natan's wife Avital was at the time. In 1974, Natan and Avital quickly and quietly married before her exit visa expired the next day, when she would leave for Israel, wishfully thinking they'd see each other in a few months.
We met 12 years after this. So I told her, sorry, I'm late.
But during those years, Avital quickly took on the role of an effective and powerful world-traveling advocate for her husband. And the campaigning worked.
I think she basically felt like she had no choice.
This is Gil Troy, also a historian, who's co-authored a book with Natan that came out in 2020 on how his time as a political prisoner prepared him for a life of public service afterwards.
She was there. She knew also that it was so easy for Natan to disappear in the Gulag. They wouldn't have to take him out for firing squad. They could give him a heart attack. They could give him a pneumonia. They could give him a rash. They could give him something, and boom. Unless she was out there day after day, unless she was pushing Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Georges Mitterrand, and it's amazing this young little woman stood up with them and to them,
Wow.
He would have disappeared. And she fought, and she not only helped save his life, but she helped cut his sentence from 13 years to 9 years.
In 1977, Natan was arrested. The following year, Avital met with the group Women for Soviet Jewry to discuss his need for a lawyer, since his original choice was deported, and so they recommended Prof, who was a prominent law professor at the time at McGill University and head of its human rights program. And so Prof hit the ground running, producing an 800-page legal brief pleading all the violations of Soviet and international law in Natan's case. And the next year, the Canadian government arranged for Prof to go to the Soviet Union to meet with the highest judicial authorities to make the case and present his brief on behalf of Natan. A move that was unprecedented back then and simply inconceivable today, considering the risks of detention or worse.
And they formally had it served on the Soviet Union.
At first, Prof kept a low profile, under the cover of a political science conference in Moscow. And as soon as the conference ended, he set out to see Natan's parents in a Moscow suburb, but was stopped on the way, arrested, and expelled from the Soviet Union.
Well, Irvin, when you were exiled from Soviet Union, what year it was?
August 79.
Here's Prof recounting his expulsion at a conference in 2012.
As I was put onto a Japanese airliner, authorities there wondering what the commotion was all about, I said 2 messages. One, just tell the Canadian embassy, if you can, that I've been expelled, and tell Dan Fisher, then the Moscow correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, that I won't be able to meet him for dinner. So when I arrived in London, first thing I did, called my wife and said, don't tell anyone. I've just been expelled from the Soviet Union. She says, what do you mean don't tell anyone? It's all over the news. Dan Fisher broke the story. It became front page headlines around the world.
The Soviet press accused him of being an, quote, agent provocateur. But as Natan tells it, this breaking international news was the moment he learned he had a lawyer.
It happened that one of the Soviet magazines wrote an article condemning the spy who came under the mask of my lawyer, Irvin Kotler, and that, of course, he was exiled from the country. So that's how I found out that I have a lawyer, Irvin Kotler.
And this story also revealed to Natan the strong political support in his corner.
And as a proof that he really was spy sent by CIA, that there was confiscated letter which he tried to smuggle of American senators written to me. So first of all, I found out that I have a lawyer. Second, I found out that there are American senators who are mobilized for this. So it was a very helpful Soviet article. But these, in 9 years, there could be only 2 or 3 such lucky articles from which I could get some information. Yeah.
I told him the story when we first met, and he said, now the spy is sitting together with the spy, Natan Sharansky. We succeeded, they failed.
It was then that Prof developed his multi-pronged advocacy model that would continue to guide his work for political prisoners throughout the years, anchored in the legal brief, to be presented at every opportunity that would expose the government's blatant violations of law, starting with
representations to the human rights violators itself, the Soviet government, to demonstrate how they were in breach of their own legal system.
And continuing to make the case before governments around the world and international institutions and forums.
So we used the United Nations system. We also established parliamentarians for the Sharansky case and cause.
The idea was to mobilize various sectors in law, government, the media, human rights, the academy, etc.
Scientists, trade unionists, the legal community, involving law schools, bar associations, lawyers, and the like. Demonstrations, mass demonstrations at the time, 10,000, 20,000, etc., year after year in every capital, confronting the Soviet Union and its leaders at every turn.
This was all to create a critical mass of advocacy engaged in
the mobilization of shame against the human rights violator.
Years later, Prof would actually have the chance to ask Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union when Natan was released, about what it was that ultimately led to the release.
He said, look, I was the Secretary of Agriculture in the Soviet Union. He said, I never knew about Natan Sharansky. He said, I know he was a household word internationally, but I never heard of him. He said, I made my first trip outside the Soviet Union to Canada. I appeared before their parliamentary committee on agriculture. He said, yes, they started to ask me questions about agriculture. They kept bringing up this name, Natan Anatoly Sharansky. I didn't know who he was. I left the Canadian Parliament building. There was this big demonstration on behalf of this Sharansky. He said, I was a guest of Eugene Whalen, the Minister of Agriculture in the Canadian Parliament. Yeah, we talked about agriculture, but he kept bringing up the name Sharansky. He said, then I became president of the Soviet Union. I looked up the file to see, who is this Sharansky? He said, then the key thing, he said, yes, he was a troublemaker, he said, but he wasn't a criminal. And then came what I called the tipping point for advocacy. He said, but it was costing us. It was costing us politically. It was costing us diplomatically. It was costing us reputationally to keep him in prison. And so I ordered his release in our self-interest. And I always believe that's the tipping point, the self-interest.
And guided by this precedent, Prof and our team are working nonstop to reach that tipping point for Vladimir.
And Putin will have to realize as well that it's in his self-interest to release Vladimir Kara-Murza, because otherwise the advocacy, the sanctioning, etc., will only intensify. We will not relent in our advocacy until he's released. So not only will Vladimir know that he is not alone, but that he has an army of advocates behind him.
Natan told me that, upon his release in 1986, he was in a hurry to write his memoir because he also viewed it as a manual for his friends and comrades left behind.
His first book, Fear No Evil, he basically wrote as a kind of how-to to survive political prison.
To those who face all these interrogations and years of prison, hoping that my experience will be of use or of help to them.
And Natan's advice would be invaluable, as there was no guarantee that anyone would survive that grueling experience.
It had to have been terrifying. It had to have been lonely. It had to have been miserable. And he was in a punishment cell, which is a sensory deprivation chamber, for 405 days. He was in the gulag with no heat. He would sometimes, use the tea they would give him 1 or 2 times a day and bring it to different parts of his body to sort of warm up. I saw a film of him visiting the gulag and visiting his prison cell. He has a big fur hat on. He has who knows how many layers and a big coat.
Right.
And he walks in and you can still see the breath. And you can still see how cold it is. And he was there with nothing.
Right.
So the misery, the loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty, because it wasn't clear that it was going to have a happy ending, makes the whole story that much more heroic.
But by the time his memoir was published in 1988, the Soviet Union was already collapsing, and so the book wouldn't serve as a manual then. But fast forward 35 years later, and 2 of the most famous political prisoners in Putin's Russia, Vladimir Kara-Murza and Alexei Navalny, are now reading Natan's memoir in prison and thanking him for helping them persevere.
Now, in these days, I received a letter from Vladimir, who told me before how important was this book, but how really this book reminds him of this reality, and he is rereading it in prison. Then I received a letter from Alexei Navalny, whom I didn't know before, who writes me that he, for the first time, he's reading this book now, and how it echoes, and how it helps him, and so. I thought, my God, after 35 years, this book finally serves to the aim for which it was written. It's very sad to think that after 35 years, we're going back to the same situation, or even worse than we were then.
The coping mechanisms that sustained Natan through prison sprung from the fundamental perspective that he was part of a historical struggle and retained his inner freedom, thus allowing him to rise above it all and view his captors as pawns. And so navigating prison was simpler in some senses, as he writes, quote, "Every day brought only one choice, good or evil, white or black, saying yes or no to the KGB." And the same outlook permeates Vladimir's writing from prison. That optimism, humor, foresight, autonomy of mind and spirit, and trust in the inevitability of historical shifts.
That's exactly how I tried to feel during all these interrogations. That of course I'm in the struggle. And I think it's very important. The humor in this case, the opportunity to make jokes about it, helps you to feel yourself more powerful than they. They are only players. And you can see where it all goes. You can see it from historical point of view. I try to fill all my interrogations with as much jokes as possible, with as much laughter as possible, especially that I can laugh on anything. They cannot laugh. So I was telling them, you see, you can't even laugh when you want to laugh. So I'm a free person, not you.
And Natan stubbornly held on to this attitude up until the final minutes, when he defied his KGB captor's orders to walk in a straight line, and instead zigzagged his way to freedom across the snowy Glinica Bridge in a prisoner exchange. Natan not only overcame prison, he went on to have a very successful career in public life, and his cheerful air never left him.
The guy has a smile. The guy has a light in his eyes,
Right.
which is really hard to imagine. And my sense is he had it before, and he wouldn't let them turn off the light.
Vladimir's decision to give up a life of safety and security in the U.S., to part from his wife and children and go back to Moscow at the most volatile period in modern history, may appear irrational to most of us today. But his decision couldn't be more well thought out and backed by history itself. A calculated sacrifice to save ourselves in the long run, rooted in the most genuine love for his children and the next generation. In his opening remarks at a May 2021 event commemorating the life of Andrei Sakharov, Vladimir explained the driving force behind such sacrifices by him and his fellow dissidents.
Talking about Andrei Sakharov's life and his biography, it's probably going to be inconceivable for so many people, both in our time, but also in his time. Why would somebody who had the life of comfort and privilege, as he did, he was part of the top academic elite, the youngest full member of the Soviet Academy of Science, somebody who was endowed with the greatest material benefits that were possible under Soviet rule, big apartment, chauffeur-driven car, access to exclusive stores, personal access to top Kremlin leaders, to give it all away voluntarily and to exchange it all for the perilous existence of a dissident in a totalitarian society.
And the answer for Vladimir comes back to the Red Square 7 who protested the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and specifically to wisdom he received from one of the demonstrators, the poet Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who he interviewed for his 2005 documentary on Soviet dissidents. Out of all the demonstrators, she paid the heaviest price of being confined to psychiatric prison. As only Vladimir can do, in this short recollection, he integrates the lessons of history, mentors, and moral courage that carried the dissident movement through the end of the Soviet Union and carries Vladimir today.
And so I asked her for that documentary, why did you do this, knowing what price you would have to pay? She had two small children. The youngest, who was a couple of months old, was actually with her in a pram on Red Square during that demonstration. And I will never forget what she responded. She said to me, going out to that demonstration was a selfish act. And I asked, what do you mean? And she said, I wanted to have a clean conscience. I'm not sure I fully grasped back then, this was more than 15 years ago when I spoke to her for this film, just what she meant. But now today, as the work of the opposition in Russia resembles in so many ways, again, unfortunately, what Anatoly Sharansky and Yelena Bonner and Sergei Kovalyov had to endure back in the 70s and 80s, I understand very well what Natalia Gorbanevskaya meant. And I have to say that this is a very powerful motivation, speaking about Alexei Navalny, speaking about what all of us continue to do to the best of our ability. It is important to have a clean conscience because silence is complicity, because inaction is complicity. If you just stand by and watch what is being done by the people who claim to speak on behalf of our country and we do nothing about it, then we would feel that we would be complicit, and that is unacceptable. And this was, I know, the most powerful motivation for Boris Nemtsov as well.
For more information, go to priceofconviction.com and tune into our next episode, Putin's Plan Backfires.